So Ernesto, thank you again for making some time to log in into what is I'm sure one of like 1,000 Zooms and conversations that we've all been having. But I think it's given us a great opportunity to kind of be able to easily pause and talk a little bit about things that are important to the Institute, about the work you started and the work that we all do at NHI. I've been wanting for a couple of years to actually sit down and chat with you specifically about the Third Reality Chronicles, let's call them. I know you're working on a third book, if I'm not mistaken. And 20 years, I believe it's been since the first
Yes.
book was published. So
Well,
a
actually,
lot's happened.
Third Reality Reveal comes about 2 years later.
And comes
So
about
18 years.
Right. So, but a lot has happened even in just 1 year. And so what I wanted to talk about is there's a theme that there's a lot of different themes that pop up in the different books, and I'm sure we'll also in this third one coming up. And I wanted to focus on these conversations mostly on just some of the core concepts that are found throughout a lot of the different chapters, a lot of the different stories and how they relate to the NHIers this year, but also existing members. I know when I think about the first book in particular, there seems to be a cast of characters that pop up throughout, namely your parents. We see some experts. A lot of other books have experts or academic quotes, but a lot of the voices or the information through your books comes through your family. So tell us a little bit about how the cast of characters of your books is more than just you, but this family journey, this family vision, if you will.
Well, Julio, it goes way back. I enjoyed very much talking to my dad growing up, talking to my mom growing up. By some historical coincidence, they end up meeting each other, marrying each other, and having 3 kids, me and my 2 brothers. My 2 brothers no longer with us. But as long as I can remember, they were so dedicated to community work as volunteers. From the moment I can remember being a 3-year-old, 4-year-old, 5-year-old, there were always kids at our house. There were always my parents sponsoring some function, some event, having a late night meeting, burning some wood, telling stories, playing football on vacant lots or softball or whatever, or doing church work. My mother in particular was introduced in 1919, just when she moved to Houston, through the Methodist Church. She was hardcore Methodist, but she met these 2 women called Mrs. Morgan and Mrs. Smith, who were missionaries. And that little church was one of their missionary objectives of helping form that church. And during that time, a lot of families were moving from the Valley of Mexico, South Texas, to Houston to find work. They were leaving an agricultural background to work in industry, dirty industry, hard work, loading ships, welding, factory work, that kind of stuff. And a lot of them didn't have any money. And so they didn't have money for apartments or homes or clothes or food. And so my mother became, through the church, very involved with helping out families, dealing with children's welfare, child nutrition. She was just a kid. She didn't understand much more except to follow instructions. Dad, on the other hand, was going through a lot of racism. Fifth Ward was a collection of Mexicans in Houston, El Quinto Barrio, as they used to call it. And right next to it was a Black community. But there were a lot of roving German and Italian juveniles that enjoyed beating up on Mexican kids. So my dad's life of defending himself was very different from my mother's life of helping people. My dad organized boxing teams so that kids could learn how to defend themselves. He helped found the first international soccer team in Houston. He was part of the Magnolia Tigers baseball team. And they all had a great life. Don't get me wrong. They adjusted to the environments, understood the realities. One thing that used to bother me a lot about what their talks was no había justicia, meaning that if ever the cops were called in, they were never going to win the argument. Things that happened, either whether the other people started, whether there was problems in the community, the Latino raza, we were never going to get the break. It was always going to be somebody else. So they grew up in a harsh reality of racial rage and hatred and separation and subjugation. And they never forgot those times. They never forgot what kind of pressure. So they were motivated and moved by changing the condition, by wanting to improve quality of life in the community, by enjoying the culture, enjoying the language, enjoying their abilities to accomplish things, organizing families to do well, helping people start their homes, construction, helping somebody start a car, buy a car. So they were always in some helping mode. And because these were small communities where families knew each other, it was more a familia than a barrio. Everybody knew everybody. Everybody knew their story and what was going on in their lives. They continued that, and I happened to come along in 1940. And by the time I was 6 or 7 or 8 years old, 9 years old, I was listening to their stories. Because if there was one thing about my parents, they did a lot of sharing of stories. They talked a lot to each other. They were wonderful partners, encouraging each other. Dad with the boys, mom with the girls, and they would trade stories a lot or know something about a family hardship or something good that happened that they wanted to celebrate. But even wherever we went from that house on McKee way out in the sticks, as mom used to call, to owning a little store. There were always kids. There were always dad would put up a boxing ring, construct one, get the kids to help him construct it. Do Boy Scouts, we would pitch tents out in the forest and spend the night and tell stories and scary stories and heartfelt stories and warm stories and exciting stories. And so we grew up, I think, in a very healthy environment. As they continued working, eventually the city heard about their work and asked them to become park directors 20, 30 years later. And so at that time, they became recreation directors in barrios of Houston that were supposed to be not very nice. They were basically, there was a lot of violence, a lot of juvenile delinquency in the community called Magnolia by the Houston Ship Channel. And then back to the Fifth Ward, Hennessy Park. So one of the parks was named the Zavala Park. And my mother became the first Latina, first park director. And it was not anything big. It was a secure job. It was 2 to 10 at night, included weekends at times. And so once again, that tradition is there. So I grew up in that environment all the way until when they retired in the 1970s. Now take a look at that. They retired 1970, 1976, 77, 78. I forget exactly when. I started NHI 1979. So my deal was continuing their tradition. My deal was I enjoyed it. It was healthy. I had a blast growing up. There were some tragic parts, but there were mostly happy things, great things that happened. And so it was a pleasure. And I promised them one day that because by this time my brother Roy had died and Albert wasn't doing very well, my oldest brother. And I remember talking to them and saying, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to start a school that trains people to do your kind of work. And Dad called it La Escuela. And I said, I'm going to do that for the rest of my life. That's after I leave the governor's office. And Gloria and I are getting together as boyfriend, girlfriend. And eventually we get married. And so she decides she's going to join in with me. And we have, to this day, 40 years later, it's been the same fun that I can understand the same fun that my parents had. It's not a journey of tragedy. It's a
Yeah.
journey of victory and good times.
I know recent years you've taken great interest, it seems, in trying to make sure that that story, not necessarily specifically the story of your specific parents, but of that early US Latino story. I know you've been very passionate about telling it. Why is that? Why is that time so important to know? And as you talk right now, I'm starting to think that even more so right now in 2020, not to take away for it, just to show how varied Latinos are, right? That a lot of the stories we're still hearing are new Latino histories, families who just got here a generation ago or less. You're talking about a Latino story that goes back longer,
100 years.
right? And so what is there to be learned or just taken from that, whether you can connect to it because you're an old San Antonio family, or you are like many other Latino kids who are maybe reading this book this year that their parents, they're maybe the first generation to live here in the United States.
Well, I think there were two worlds that historians failed to realize are there. There is a world of suppression. There is a world that exploits people purposely and wants a cheap working class so that they can make profits, and factories and construction and labor. There's that reality of what is a working class and how do I make money off this working class. I think that story has been going on for a long time. And with the American indigenous community, with the Black community, with the Latino brown community, that story of racial rage and racial exploitation is real and it has its history. There's another story that rarely gets told, and that's the story of joy, the story of families enjoying their lives together, knowing what the opposition, knowing what the conditions are, knowing the few resources they had, small victories, a lot of love, a lot of interdependency. All of those things go into victory, shared victories and shared celebrations. And when somebody got married and had their first kid, or some kid got their first pair of shoes, or they spent weekends killing a pig and making chicharrones, or the stories of family togetherness, of love, of going through World War II. A lot of my cousins, as a matter of fact, 8 of my cousins were in World War II. They were in the shooting war. And my mother was she's the only person that could read and write well, would send them daily letters, all of them. And they would write Tia a letter and they would go, I miss you, Tia. How's my dad and how's my mom? And she would read the letters out loud to us as children, because there was a big age difference between my first cousins and us. We were the youngest of all the cousins. We were in our 5 and 6 and 7. They were 17 and 18 years old, and they volunteered for World War II. And then, of course, we get the death notice of Alfred getting killed when landing in Normandy. And of course, that put us into a huge depression, because he came up he was almost adopted by my father. He was like an older brother in our home, and now we're missing a cousin, more like a brother. And so there were things about getting jobs, or getting married, or going to weddings and quinceañeras and wedding anniversaries, or going to La Porte, or going to the bay to go fish together in a little rowboat, just having fun, camping out. We had a lot of fun. That was an untold story. And if you go into barrios, with all of the tragedy we want to associate with living in a barrio, there's more happiness than there is tragedy. There is more celebration than there is sadness. And I don't think we ever write about that. So that's number one. The other thing, that if I learned anything from my father and mother, it was whatever you put your mind to do, you can do. If you have the discipline and the focus and the discipline and the behaviors and the commitment to not look at the obstacles, but look at the opportunity, spend time working on your skills, that there's very little that you can't do at the end of the day if you put your mind to it. They went into communities that had very little and produced nothing but championship athletics, boys and girls sports. They had the most trophies. My mother had the most trophies. Didn't know anything about sports in Houston. Didn't know the first thing about, she didn't even know how to keep score. But she was a great motivator. She made kids feel wanted, valued, important. And that was what I learned and my takeaway. And Dad was more of a soul guy. He would get inside the spirit of kids, and he felt for them and he understood them. And he understood particularly the Pachucos, the guys that were going kind of the wrong way. They loved Dad because he would sit down and play dominoes with them and take a chair and listen to their sad stories and tragic stories at times, and understood what they were doing and why they were doing it, and never endorsed it, but always stood by them. Even if they were in jail, he'd go see them in jail and help take them out and give them a ride home. Or if he was on his way to town and he saw somebody at the bus stop waiting to go downtown, he would stop and give them a ride. And so El Viejito was really well known and really well loved by even the worst guys in the community. So mom and dad introduced a lot of love and a lot of care and a lot of cariño to the community. And so everybody knew Mr. and Mrs. Nieto and respected us because we were their sons.
So throughout this book, there's a lot of the first book. I know there's a lot of quotes and that come from your dad, the infamous Santos Nieto, as you sometimes call him. The second book, I feel like, has a lot of your mother's voice, and even one of the chapters is called "Legacy of Family." You know, NHI, at least for a lot of us, it's the leader's journey, right? From great debate and on, it's this leader's journey. Why is the family element so important to telling this story or to developing a leader? I think a lot of times we can look to, you know, business books or operations and systems manuals on leadership. You take a different angle. You start with family. You start with these voices de la casa. Why do you start there?
Because we weren't only the children of Santos and Esther Nieto. We were the children of the Rodriguez family, of the Cardona family, of the Vasquez family, of the Alfaro family. These were all relatives. We were one giant family, and we saw each other all the time, not a little bit, all the time. Dad would get up in the morning, and first thing he would do is get in his car and get a cup of coffee and go see his brother. On weekends, should I say. My mom would go see her mother or her brothers, and we would tag along. So our social friends were our cousins. Our church friends were our family. Our tragedy support systems were our grandmothers and our tias and our tios. The stories in the family, the who did what, who accomplished what, do you remember when, all those things came from a core family of shared histories. And it was fun hanging out with cousins because we never fought. We never competed with each other. We always looked out for each other's interests. And I mean, if we went downtown, we were 6 cousins. I mean, who was going to mess with us? If we went to Galveston, we were 12, 15 cousins. We were going to go have fun, and everybody looked out for each other, including the females. A lot of them, Nina and Felipa and Chavela, they all looked merry. We all looked out for each other, whether we were downtown church. We loved being with each other. So the church was comprised in one way or another of relatives. So, and then some other families that were might as well have been relatives. So we would go eat at their homes after church. We'd get invited to this home or that home, or we'd invite someone to our. So there was always a sense of togetherness, and everybody called each other brother and sister. So family legacy, it was as simple as this: me sitting around at the house as a 13-year-old or 14-year-old doing nothing but watching TV, and dad walking in and going, "What are you doing?" Because I was in them. Well, I'm watching TV. You don't have anything to do. Go over to your tia's and help her out. Help her out do what? Whatever she needs. So I'd walk over to my tia's and I'd say, "Dad sent me to help you." And she would go, "Yeah, okay, well, let's do this together." And I'd help her cook, or I'd help her with her car, or I'd help clean something, I'd rake her yard. No estar diocas, not be idle. My dad didn't want us to be idle. He always wanted us to be doing something. So it was go help tia, go help abuelita, go spend the night with your grandmother tonight. And it was always yes, sir, yes, ma'am. So we were always doing something that was loving and close and valuable and fun. It was fun. I can't emphasize that enough. We felt very secure that people loved us. It wasn't just our parents. It was our cousins and our tias and our tios and our grandparents and our grand aunts and la tia Chole, el tío Fidel. Ay, viene Ernesto. ¿Cómo estás, tío Dio? You know, it was this identity. ¿Cómo está tu papá? Bien, tío. And that, when I write the story of the legacy of family, that's what it meant to me. Is that this was not just my parents and my brothers. We were not a core family. We were not a nuclear family. We were an extended family in every sense of the word. We were almost like a township, and everybody loved each other. So that to me has given me strength through the years. Even to this day, I will listen to some comment by Sarah Coronado. Now, that's my cousin in Houston. That's Mickey's little daughter. You know, and she's a grown woman at 50 years old, but we still read each other's emails. Have we seen each other in the last several years? No, but we know we're related to each other. And so that continues to be a very fond part of my makeup. A very, they're very glad for me. They're very happy for my success. They're very honored to be a Nieto or a Rodriguez. Or does that make sense? I hope it makes sense.
What you just said, and I wasn't thinking about this before we were talking up until right now, that I started remembering, and this isn't in the book, but a few years ago, we were in a South Texas community working with some middle school students. And like all NHI programs, it was a leadership experience. It was a leadership development moment. And we chose to use we asked the kids to look for a family legend or a family story. Why was that in some ways the trigger or the reaction or the stimulus, if you will, in working with those students who are going to build leaders? In other words, again, it wasn't this, we're all going to go read this book and
Yeah,
summarize these chapters or go watch this YouTube of Dr. So-and-so. The leadership journey for those kids started, I need you to go home and I need you to find a story.
yeah.
Because I feel like that's what you're trying to get. You're trying to push us in reading in some of these chapters. I feel like that's where you're trying to take our thinking.
Absolutely, absolutely. I because of the COVID, I hadn't seen my grandkids as much, and when we do, it's at a distance. And for Thanksgiving, Bella says, "I am so mad, Grandpa." And I go, "What are you mad about?" Just being Grandpa, right? She says, "I'm so mad that I can't come over and hug you." And I go, "Well, don't worry about it. We'll do it soon enough." And Paulina goes, "I'm mad too." And I go, "Why?" She goes, "I can't hug you." You know, grandparents, you have a little daughter, grandparents will kill for their grandkids. You know, grandkids are everything to them, and that sense of closeness. So in Latino culture, there's always someone that champions you. There's always someone who understands you in that, whether it's a cousin, a boy cousin, a female cousin, a tío, a tía, a grandma.
Padrino, yeah.
Someone understands and someone puts up the cover and protects you and say, "Come here, sit down for a minute, son." And they take you off for a ride or they sit out in the back and talk to you. Someone cares for you. Someone explains to you. Someone helps you through those moments in life that you need guidance and you need counsel and you need warmth and value. And so the reason I asked those kids, who was your hero? And I don't know if you remember this, but it was a lot of grandmothers. And I know why, because that's where they got left when parents took off for work.
Mm-hmm.
That's who they were with on weekends when mom and dad had to go shopping or go to run errands. That's who made them late dinner. That's who let them get away with murder. That's who they slept with and heard old stories. Because I know that Gloria is playing that role now with her grandnieces, that she tells them the old stories of her mother and Isma and Ms. De Leon and
Yeah.
Linda De Leon and all that kind of stuff. So that's the connection, because in our culture, we want to know who are all the people connected to us, because we know that we're the sum total of many, not the sum total of only a few. And to us, it doesn't matter whether they were poor, whether they were gangsters, whether they were in prison, whether they were millionaires. To us, it doesn't matter. Those things, what matters is that we're all related.
So
Good and
on
bad.
that, one last question on this segment about these different elders and familial voices in your life that you share with us. I always like, and I think I left the book in the other room, but there's this great line I always remember from your grandmother, where she tells you that we all have, everybody has their own brain, everybody has their own mind.
Mhm.
And I can't help but feeling that little germ of a thought is very central to NHI learning and how we encourage our students to learn and our members to learn.
Yeah. Well, it's the same thing as saying every head that is its own universe. Everybody interprets and views the world through their own lenses. and based on their life experiences and life journey, that's going to color the prisms through which they view, see, perceive, and interpret. Now, we call them mental models as well, but we see the world through those lenses and through everything that influenced us to see something in that vein and in that context. Yeah, cada cabeza es un mundo, meaning that everybody comes to their own conclusions based on the realities of their lives. And I have found that to be true. And so rather than them being like me or agreeing with me, I have to be patient and understand, well, that's how they see things. That's how they've come to see and view and interpret and perceive. And that's how they develop attitudes and behaviors. And those are realities for them. And if you don't understand people on that, then you're trying to impose your will and your perceptions and your interpretations on them. And in that context, you're not doing, you're not engaging in a free exchange of information. You're trying to somehow preach down to people, at least in my view.